A very good morning to everyone. My name is Elder Tang Chi Hao, and this presentation is reflective analysis of all my experience in the city confectionery role-play simulation for BUS30031 Sustainable Business Practices. In this simulation, I took a role of Chief Executive Officer or CEO or city confectionery. Throughout this presentation, I will reflect on my ethical decision-making process, culture awareness, stakeholder consideration, and the lesson I learned about ethical leadership and responsible business practices. Moving on. Uh-huh. So here's a video of the role play. So here's an introduction. The role play simulation highlights the complexity of ethical decision making in global business environment where culture, economic, and social factors influence organizational behavior. The simulation based on allegation of child labor within a city confectionery supply chain, which created ethical concerns regarding transparency, worker welfare, and corporate responsibility. As a CEO, I was required to respond professionally to difficult questions while balancing the company's reputation, stakeholder trust, and ethical accountability. This presentation reflects on how my attitude, behavior, and leadership responses influence my ethical decision during the simulation, while also examining how ethical theories and cultural awareness shape my understanding of responsible leadership. So here's a scenario you can see. In the simulation itself, I represented of the CEO of the city confectionery during an investigation regarding potential child labor practices within subcontracting operations. Throughout the roleplay, I experienced pressure when answering difficult questions related to labor standard, transparency, and international business ethics. One challenge was balancing honesty and accountability while also protecting the organization's reputation and international partnership, particularly with Bibli Health Services. This experience demonstrates how ethical dilemmas in global business are rarely simple because leaders must consider financial sustainability, stakeholder trust, legal compliance, and human welfare simultaneously. Yeah. So moving on, sorry for the lag right there. Moving on, cultural awareness and ethical reflection. One important learning experience during the simulation was understanding how cultural and economic conditions can influence ethical perspective. In some communities, child work may be viewed as a form of family support due to poverty and financial hardship. Economic pressure can influence labor practices, especially in regions where families rely on informal work to survive. However, despite these cultural and economic realities, I recognize that exploitation which harms a child education, development, and well-being remains unethical and unacceptable. This reflection helped me realize the importance of avoiding immediate judgment and instead understanding the broader social context before making ethical decisions. At the same time, cultural understanding should never be used as an excuse to justify unethical business practices. Next slide, theoretical application. The first ethical theory that influenced my decision was utilitarianism. Utilitarianism focused on achieving the greatest good for the greatest number of people. During the summer simulation, I believe continuing the partnership under strict ethical conditions would create a better long-term outcomes compared to immediately terminating the relationship. This approach allows a company to remain accountable while improving labor conditions, increasing transparency, and strengthening supply monitoring system. For utilitarian perspective, immediate termination may protect the company reputation in short term, but also may also negatively impact the workers, community, and business sustainability. Therefore, I believe ethical improvement and long-term corrective action would create a positive outcome for stakeholder overall. Moving on, stakeholder theory. Another important theory applied during the simulation is stakeholder theory by Freeman. Stakeholder theory explains that businesses should consider the interests of stakeholders affected by organizational decisions, not only shareholders or profits. In this situation, the stakeholder, including worker, children, family, consumer, investor, Blibli Health Next, and employee of City Confectionery. The simulation helped me to realize that ethical leadership requires balancing the needs of well-being of multiple stakeholder groups. It also strengthened my understanding that long-term trust and sustainability are closely connected to how organizations treat their stakeholders during the ethical crisis. Next and final theory will be corporate social responsibilities. CSR explained that business have responsibility beyond profit making and should contribute positively to societies through ethical business practices. During the simulation, I realized that organization must actively ensure that ethical sourcing, worker protection, and supply chain transparency instead of focusing on financial performance. This experience highlighted that businesses are expected to take responsibilities not only for direct operation but also for action of suppliers and subcontractors within their supply chains. Ethical business practices are important because they influence public trust, brand reputation, and long-term sustainability. Moving on. So here's an ethical issue identified. So these include allegation of child labor within a subcontract operation, lack of supply transparency, and concern regarding corporate accountability. There were also risks involving damage to international reputation and trust, particularly because global markets play a strong emphasis on ethical sourcing and compliance. This experience showed me how ethical failures on one part of supply chain can affect the reputation or sustainability of an entire organization. So here's my sponsor. As a CEO, I responded by clarifying that CT confectionery does not directly employ underage worker. However, I also acknowledge that risk may exist within subcontract networks, and I expressed commitment towards investigation, accountability, and corrective actions. Initially, I noticed that I became more defensive because I felt responsible of protecting the organization image and partnership. However, as the simulation progressed, I realized that ethical leadership requires transparency and accountability instead of avoiding or denying. This reflection helped me to understand the importance of responsible honesty and professionalism during the ethical crisis. Next slide will be the ethical decision-making framework. Throughout the simulation, I applied both stakeholder theory and to guide my decisions. I attempted to balance this business sustainability with ethical responsibility by considering both organization survival and stakeholder well-being. The simulation taught me that ethical decision making is not about following laws and protecting profit, but also considering the long-term consequences of decisions on people and society. This experience strengthened my understanding that ethical leadership requires empathy, critical thinking, and accountability. Stakeholder impact. The ethical issue affected multiple stakeholders, such as workers, children, families, communities, baby health center, consumer, investor, and employees. These simulations also show me how ethical problems in supply chain can damage stakeholder trust globally, especially in international organizations, prioritize ethical sourcing and sustainability. This strengthened my understanding of how interconnected stakeholders are in global business operation. Here's a challenge. One major challenge was responding professionally under pressure while managing difficult ethical questions. I also struggle with balancing transparency and accountability while protecting the company reputation and international partnership. The role play highlighted the tension between financial concern and ethical responsibility, which make decision making more complex. This helped me to understand that ethical leadership often involves trade-off and emotional pressure. My recommendation was BUS Health Next to continue the partnership under strict ethical conditions. These conditions include stronger labor audits, improved compliance monitoring, increased supply chain transparency, and better worker protection. I believe this approach will encourage accountability and long-term improvement rather than simply avoiding responsibility throughout determination. This recommendation reflects a balanced ethical approach that considers both stakeholder well-being and sustainability business improvement. So what I learned about myself, this simulation helped me to learn several important things about myself as a business leader. However, I also learned that ethical leadership requires accountability, empathy, and transparency instead of avoidance. I became more aware of how business decisions can directly affect vulnerability groups such as children and workers. Additionally, I gained confidence in analyzing ethical dilemmas from multiple stakeholders' perspectives and considering both ethical and business consequences before making decisions. Overall, this experience strengthened my understanding that leadership is not about protecting profit, but also protecting people and maintaining long-term trust. As a future business professional, this actually will influence how I approach ethical in decision making. I will prioritize ethical audits, supply chain monitoring, and transparent communication within the organization. I also aim to strengthen ethical workplace culture by encouraging accountability and responsible leadership practices. This seamlessly changed my understanding of leadership from simply protecting the organization to also protecting the people impacted by the business decision. In conclusion, the city confidential role-play simulation demonstrated that ethical dilemmas in global business are highly complex and require balanced judgment. The experience strengthened my understanding of ethical leadership, stakeholder accountability, and cultural awareness in business decision making. It also helped me to recognize the importance of empathy, transparency, and responsible leadership when responding to ethical challenges. How overall, this simulation provided valuable insight that will possibly influence my future ethical decision making a business professional. Here's a reference, and here's a Google Doc transcript that I did the role play. Thank you.